I think that worked out all right. Oh, we did. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate you. Yeah. Liz, it's like Lazarus.
Start. We have 8 bills, I believe, before us today, and we have a sign-up sheet. Any legislators here that need to be somewhere? All right, Delegate Bell, I believe you have 2 before us today. Welcome.
Welcome, Mr. Chairman. How you doing? Is there any particular order you want to do?
It's all up to you, sir.
Okay, let's do 134 first. HB 134, Value Engineering. Mr. Chairman, what this does is value engineering, which is a systematic process review engineering projects to make sure they're efficient. What this does is raise the ceiling from $5 million to $10 million. Originally, we had put in at $15 million, and through committee amendments, it went to $5. And the reason for this change, it had not been updated since 2001, and there have been actually a number of projects that were $4 million projects, and they ran into a cost increase, unknown lines, etc., which caused the value engineering study to be done at the last minute. And those value engineering studies costing $50,000 to $200,000 typically delay a project anywhere from several months to up to a year. So the bottom line is we want to raise that ceiling up so we aren't spending up to $200,000 for a savings which would be minimal. And that's really the bill in a nutshell. While I'm a fan of value engineering, it's important to make sure the return on investment's there to justify the cost and the time of the study. And in this case, I think we're reducing government size and overreach by making that a more modern ceiling. Be happy to answer any questions, Mr.
Thanks, sir. I do have one question. The committee will allow me. Now, you went from 5 to 15, now you're back to 10. Why the 15 initially, and now why coming back to 10?
What we did is we picked the $15 million because we felt like that would be the greatest good, and frankly, I think that there are some significant stakeholders who would prefer the higher amount because then again, the higher the dollar amount is where the sweet spot of projects are at, and we make sure that the project dollar amount is high enough to justify the need for the study. Now, the reason why we went to 10 is if you looked at just straight inflation since 2001 to today, that would put the bill put the amount about $7.6 million. And but we looked at the amount of projects that have been studied on this, and we would actually do a great deal of good just at the $10 million threshold because in the past year that would pick up roughly over 50% of the projects where the study didn't justify the cost. So that's why we compromised the $10 million.
Thank you, sir. Now, I understand that no amendments actually came over. Is that correct? So technically, we're still at 15 here.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that the amendments were adopted in a transportation subcommittee, but they were not reported out of the full committee. It was just straight referred to general law, so we would need to adopt those amendments.
All right.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Delegate Pease.
If it's the will of the subcommittee not to adopt the will of the subcommittee of transportation, we're certainly free to do that. It's really the patrons' call on that since they weren't adopted.
Mr. Chairman, for me?
Yes, sir.
Frankly, I think the most good can be done to save money and be more efficient at 15 million versus 10. But my wish would be to move the bill forward, and if 10 moves it forward, 10's good. 15 moves it forward, even better. And I believe we do have some. Yeah, I do have a couple head nods back there for some supporters of the higher amount. So if it'd be to your will, Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be good to hear from some of the significant stakeholders who could benefit from this.
Okay. Welcome. Actually, unless it's the committee's will to make that amendment, we can hear from the stakeholders prior to that motion.
Mr. Chairman, Rob Bohannon with the Virginia Transportation Construction Alliance. We support the bill, and as Delegate Bell mentioned, 10 is good, 15 is great. I mean, we think it promotes efficiency and prevents these prevents it from being used on projects where it's really small and not necessary.
Thanks, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, Patrick Cushing with Williams Mullen on behalf of the American Council of Engineering Companies, and we would prefer and support the $15 million threshold. We think that probably is a better fit to value engineering. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
So where are we, Mr. Chairman?
Are we at 15?
We're at 15.
Okay.
No amendments have been adopted.
Very good. No way that needs to be adopted.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say,
Yeah. No amendments have been made to the bill.
in closing remarks on this, unless there are any other questions, is the locality, Loudoun County, who asked me to carry this bill, supports the higher amount, and that was based on the projects they've had and the fact that they would save the most money and actually help to get projects completed faster.
Okay. Thank you, Delegate Bell. Any questions from the committee?
Move to report.
Second.
The motion properly seconded. Any discussion? All right, members, cast your vote. All right, close the roll. Delegate Davis.
He's voted.
He's green.
He has trouble operating heavy equipment.
I banked the subcommittee yesterday, it didn't help.
What's that?
Your hands.
Yeah, destroy the roll.
Destroy the roll. Let's try this again.
Yeah, destroy the roll.
Destroy the roll. Let's try this again. All right.
He's at the wrong station.
Who were you trying to be?
Leftwich.
Oh,
He was
jeez.
leftwich.
All right. Let's try again, folks.
There we go.
All right, everyone's voted. The chair's voted. There we go. Close the roll. Bill passes 6-0. All right, Delegate Bell.
Mr. Chairman, House Bill 59. This is was actually in the same area of the code. Add something called practical design to the code, and this is practical design has been used in various other states. It started in Missouri. Missouri, in the first 5 years of using this, actually saved $1 billion, about $200 million a year. There's been 9 other states have adopted it, and they found it to generate great cost savings. It would go hand in hand with the value engineering. I would submit one line amendment on line 27, changing the $5 million to $15 million.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again, please?
On line 27, where it says costing more than $5 million, change it to $15 million. So, but again, coincide with the with actually what we have in the previous bill. So practical design would basically charge our engineers to engineer, and it would use design methods that would focus on improvements that meet but do not exceed the project's initial objective, encourage flexibility, see cost savings, allow for the reuse of existing infrastructure where feasible. I'll give you a couple examples. If we rebuild a bridge and the pylons on the old bridge can be used and are safe and meet the needs, we might actually have to add on to it, but we reuse them to save project cost. If we were to redo a road and the existing guardrails can be reused and they meet safety standards, then they would be reused, not torn down and replaced. Perhaps the other thing would be we're building roads that we need, and we're not trying to build to perfection. Building perfection, which frankly often happens, increases the cost of a project, and the time and scope creep is commonly called. So this would basically build a road to the need. So we build a road in a more rural area. We don't build it to the same standards as a road in a highly urban area. I'll close with saying that this has been a cost-saving method that has been widely used in other states. 10 states have adopted it. There's various terms. Practical design is the most commonly called term, and it's been wildly successful, generating hundreds of millions of billion-dollar savings in Missouri in 5 years. Some of this is happening already via VDOT, I'll tell you that, but it's not 100% on all projects. By codifying it, it would make it clear that we want our engineers to engineer, and we hold cost and savings as very important, and it would really make that a formal charge on all projects. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to answer any questions you, the committee, have.
Okay. Thank you, Delegate Brown. Do we have any questions from the committee?
Is someone from VDOT here, Mr. Chairman? No. That's
Good
perfect.
question. I was going to ask that same question. Any additional questions from the committee? Actually, I would like to hear from representatives from VDOT.
Mr. Chairman, Emmett Helsel with the department. We have no official position on the bill. As Delegate Bell said, we are initiating this concept on several projects. We have been doing it since 2015 when we published internal guidance to the department. I agree with that practical design has advantages. For us, it's really a culture and a way of operating now. And we seek to make sure that we institute it on our projects through refined scopes, making sure we're doing, just as the delegate said, aligning objectives with the work that we're going to do. The second thing is we apply, particularly in highway engineering, we apply flexibility that's allowed by AASHTO, the state's guidance for engineering practice, to the extent we can. And where appropriate and applicable and sound engineering can be applied, we will ask for exceptions. It's a little bit more difficult to do that in some facets of our practice. In bridge engineering, for instance, where design principles are pretty fixed and materials are pretty well known, it's a little more difficult. But in highway engineering, we are attempting to do it and have been since 2015. I'll say no more at this point, answer any other questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the committee? Delegate Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had mentioned that VDOT has this in practice today. Is it on any project that would benefit from this, or just projects over a certain dollar threshold?
Right now, Mr. Chairman, Delegate Davis, right now we tend to, our objective is to do it on all projects regardless of scope and size. I will say we will expect to see potentially greater benefits probably from projects that have broader scopes, usually with more dollar value. If we're doing a particular, like a series of paving remodel jobs or regular schedule work from year to year, the likelihood of seeing something grandiose coming out of that where we're going to see savings and new concepts is probably very limited.
Yeah, thank you.
So you are, any further questions from the committee on this? So you're already doing this internally. This is just codifying your current practice and putting a dollar threshold on that amount to do it over the 15 million.
I'm not going to speak for the delegate.
I guess that's for the delegate. So you're just, it's a current practice now, so.
Mr. Chairman, I've actually conferred with VDOT on this, and while they do try to do it, there are some projects that are happening, it doesn't occur. So that's why the bill would make sure it has to occur in all projects, but also setting the dollar threshold at the 15 million. Because again, while I'm a fan of these methods, don't want to use them when they're not cost effective and they'll bring us a return on investment. And setting the ceiling to make sure we're not spending more on the project than it's been actually retained.
Is there ever a time, oh, go ahead, Delegate Davis, I'll say my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I always love to hear best practices, but I also like to hear not mandating things when people build a culture around them as well. You mentioned this has not always been the case. Are there a set of projects that you're aware of that they haven't utilized this as best practice?
I actually asked for a list of projects and a percentage of projects using it, and if we're not using it, and unfortunately that was not supplied, so I can't list that for you. And my only thought is, frankly, I applaud VDOT for taking measures to use this. I want to save every dollar we can save, and if there's a chance, we have 1,800 bridges that are structurally deficient in the Commonwealth today, where our engineers are working hard to keep them usable. So if we can stretch dollars to go and address those bridge problems, that's my goal and desire. If we can make sure that we take our dollars and do more projects and do them to the need, not to perfection, that's what I want to do. So while I could get an exact answer on that, to answer your question, I could say my hope is to make sure that no projects are not done as efficiently as they can, and that's why I wanted to codify and do the bill.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, follow up if I may?
Delegate Davis.
I can appreciate that. I think all of us want the best cost savings as possible. But before we go, when we tell a division that as best as they try to build a culture, they didn't. You said that you couldn't get the percent for, they used it and didn't. Is there a chance that they did use them on all that was capable, or did they tell you that they didn't on some, just didn't tell you what percentage it was?
Mr. Chairman, what I was told is they believed that there were some who didn't use it, but they couldn't give me an exact figure. I do believe in good faith they are using it on the majority of them. And frankly, I debated about, I don't want to codify something that doesn't need to be codified, and I don't want to do anything to mess with that culture. I believe they're moving in the right direction, and frankly, this would help them to move faster. Because and some people, frankly, some of the engineers have bought this. And the idea is to basically make it easier for them to get on board why they need to do this.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions? All right, let's hear from some more folks. Anyone to speak in favor of the bill? In opposition. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, chairman of the Virginia Bicycling Federation, we certainly support saving money for the state and certainly value engineering. I've talked to some of my counterparts in other states, and they've had some problems with the practical design methods, where especially bike and pedestrian type facilities have been engineered out using this. So for that reason, we have to oppose the bill.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Rob Bohannon on behalf of the Virginia Transportation Construction Alliance. Again, 300 contractors, aggregate producers, engineers, suppliers, and service providers that build and maintain Virginia's transportation network. And to Delegate Davis's point, VDOT has an informational instructional manual on practical design standards that's utilized. Our client is not aware of any time where that they haven't had the flexibility they need to use those standards. So we think it's being used as it should be, and there's no need to codify that. So for that reason, we oppose the bill.
Okay, thanks, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, Patrick Cushing with Williams Mullen on behalf of the American Council of Engineering Companies. Unfortunately, we do have to oppose the bill. While the practical design standards is something that many engineers hold themselves to and public entities hold themselves to, by codifying it, what you're doing is you're putting in hard language in the code that may set up conflicts between an engineering design firm and a public entity, and perhaps even a third party that may have standing to challenge something under practical design standards when you have a fixed language in the code. And so for that reason, we'll have to oppose the bill.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Anyone else? Delegate Bell.
Mr. Chairman, I take with me the distinct honor of having two people speak for one bill and the very next bill against it. I would just say the concerns about bicyclers, that actually is just, they would have to stick to the design, which if that was in the initial design, they could just take that out for cost saving measures, it would still stay. So I understand the gentleman's concerns. I don't think that's actually a valid one. Again, my goal is just to save money and to make sure that we do stretch our dollars as far as we can. And I appreciate the questions and the concerns. And with that, Mr. Chairman, stand by.
All right, committee members, any questions or further discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Delegate Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can definitely appreciate the delegate's concern to save money, but my only concern with this bill is, first, we now take a practice that happens almost on every project, regardless of dollar figure, and create a perception that it only has to happen on those in excess of $15 million. And I'd hate to undo a culture where, regardless of amount, you look for cost savings and just codify the fact that we only have to do it now about $15 million. Secondly, we do a lot of times where we tell departments what they have to do, but sometimes I hesitate to want to do that when they've built a culture themselves and they can own that success, for us to take it away and have others think that it's only being done now because we codified it. So I would say that we continue to look at this practice, make sure it's being done, but as long as it's being done on their own as well as it has been, let's not change the culture, and for that reason I move that we pass it by.
All right, we have a motion. Passed by, definitely. motion properly seconded. Open roll. All those care vote, the care vote. Oh, I'm sorry. Close the roll. I did see that. PBI 5-2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Appreciate your time.
Yes, sir. All right, who do we have here? Leftwich is here. We have Delegate Landis.
Mr. Chairman, I've got House Bill 760.
All right, committee members, turn your attention to 760.
Mr. Chairman, this bill comes to you because of a constituent review of activities that occurred with a local public school system and an $85 turkey.
Did I hear that right?
An $85 turkey. In working with DOE, Department of Education, and with their guidelines and with local school systems guidelines, what occurred is the procurement officer for a local school system wanted to purchase fresh bird, basically, for preparation at a school. The problem came and was pointed out to me by a constituent who actually did a FOIA request where, one, they didn't contact but one provider of said fresh turkeys. And in our neck of the woods, Mr. Chairman, there are lots of providers of fresh turkeys, and actually some that are organically grown that are less than $85. And what occurred through the FOIA request, we realized that the problem with the code now is it gives sole discretion and no limitations to occurrence like that happening. So what we tried to do with this legislation, if you look on page 2, lines 110 through 112, for any Virginia-grown food products, which we want to promote, we're not trying to limit that, but to exceed $100,000, that they provide, provided that the procurement is accomplished by a couple conditions. One, obtaining written informal solicitations, a minimum of 3 bidders or offers, and 2, including a written statement regarding the basis of awarding the contract. Legislative Services tried to address our concern, obviously, with this legislation, and that's what we're attempting to try to do. The reason I think this is important is we don't need to have public bodies purchasing live or recently deceased animals that are fresh and promoting our agriculture products that basically exceed the reasonable cost that most of us individually would either obtain for our own families or for those that maybe want to provide that for someone else. So, Mr. Chairman, that's all we're trying to attempt to get at. I know there's some opposition to it, but quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, this is what we came up with to try to address this issue. And to be quite frank, something needs to be done.
Thank you, Delegate Landis. All right, committee members, any questions? No questions? Any discussion?
Are there any speakers, Mr.
Yeah, I
Chairman?
was going to ask that. Anyone speak for the bill?
I'll speak against it.
He likes $85 for
Bill Hefty, representing the Virginia Association of Governmental Purchasing. We talked about this in the Legislative Committee. We supported this bill 2 years ago when it was first introduced to have the exemption from the Procurement Act for Virginia locally grown products because we thought it was a good idea. The issue, I think, with the procurement people is one of how do they actually do this? If you have Virginia-grown products, maybe in Delegate Landis's area, you can find 3 people who will do turkeys in the rest of the state. It may not be that easy to find 3
obviously they're purchasing, but yes, for a small amount. The point, I think the most important part of this is getting 3 choices. In the example that I gave you, they only contacted one place, and obviously by doing that, they got the most expensive that they could get, and didn't even attempt to get something that was less expensive. And so I understand the concerns from the procurement officers, and I don't want to do anything not to promote Virginia-grown products, but I also think it's not reasonable that a local government procurement officer goes out and purchases something that expensive when, again, in this case, with schools and school nutrition programs and food programs, I think it wasn't just one bird they were buying. They were buying enough for the entire school system. And if you multiply that by the number that they needed for their food service folks to prepare, that was a pretty stiff cost for turkey, which is good, and it's a good nutritional product. But I just think that there needs to be some limitations because, to be honest with you, we can't afford to have our schools spending money that they don't have.
Okay. Thank you, Delegate Landis. Committee members? For discussion? What's your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask the gentleman who just spoke before to answer a question? I understand your point that you're making. Can you give me some example of where this isn't reasonable or practical? Because I almost feel like you could amend it by saying, put it in the words, after a minimum of 3 bidders, if practical. In other words, if it's not, and maybe there is a place where it's not practical to get 3 bids.
Yeah, an example would be in a rural county where you're buying produce, probably more than anything else.
Well, he's in a rural county, though, isn't he?
Yeah, another rural county other than his.
So you would say that there are examples where you could not come up with 3 bids?
Yeah, I think so. So it's really the mandatory 3. If the words that you suggested about if practical were in there, that certainly makes it a lot better.
What do you think of that, Delegate Landis?
Well, I would say rural areas is probably not the problem.
Yeah.
I would say an area like Fairfax where, or Arlington, yeah, excuse me, where,
you mix us all up.
where you might not, I think you have a lot of folks that bring stuff from farm markets and the like, but you don't have a farm that's within driving distance of, so I can see that being more of a problem. But rural areas would not be the problem. And I don't have any problem if you all want to try to narrow the scope or provide a little option. We're not trying to make an undue burden, but we are trying to set more of a standard that's not there now, that these procurement officers really at least look for or attempt to look for more than one provider. And 2, that there be some accountability and transparency there.
Mr. Chairman, if the patron is comfortable with me inserting if practicable after the word bidders, after the word offers. With just the words if practicable.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a problem with that as long as and you all know procurement in this section of the code much better than I, so I would defer to your judgment. But as long as they're attempting to get 3, but then if they can't, it's okay if they got 2 or if they've got 1 or whatever. I think that is a standard that needs to be at least considered.
Mr. Chairman, just on the concept I think that's being offered by Delegate Hope, it would follow that written statement would still include the basis for awarding the contract. So my sense is that the written statement would suggest that it wasn't practical to get 3 offers. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's right. I don't want, if it's impossible for you to get 3, then that would cancel the whole turkey roast, and I wouldn't want to do that.
No.
And so if it's not possible, then I'd want to have some built-in mechanism so they can continue to, maybe they can only get 2 bids, for example. That's all I'm trying to get at.
The question, we understand the concern from Delegate Hope, and I guess the question would be from council, would that be the easiest fix?
Yes, that would be fine.
Move that amendment.
We have a motion
that is a much more streamlined version of the bill.
Move the substitute, Mr. Chairman.
Motion properly second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Substitute bills before us.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 297 is designed to bring some additional transparency to the process by which state agencies adopt guidance documents. And I know you all are more aware than any other group that if you are adopting a regulation through the Administrative Processes Act, that they have a very rigorous public input process. What I think most people might not know is that when it comes to guidance documents, the only thing in the law with respect to public input, actually there's nothing with respect to public input, it's just that after a guidance document has been published, then it has to be put up on the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall website. So there's no opportunity for any proactive input into a guidance document in Virginia. And so what this bill in its substitute form does is really three very simple things. The first is that when an agency proposes a guidance document, that you would simply provide a 30-day window for public input into that guidance document. And so in talking with the good folks over with the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall, that would simply mean that they would put a link up there on their website where you could get access to the document and you can go ahead and take a look at that. The second thing that it does is that it requires the agency to provide notification to its stakeholders that there's an opportunity to comment on these guidance documents. This doesn't require anything extra because the APA already requires these agencies to maintain a stakeholder list. So they would just send it out to the list that they would normally do for the regulations. And the third one is really providing a relief valve if you think that the guidance document is actually a regulation in disguise. And so the code is very nebulous with respect to what is a regulation versus what is a guidance document. And so there's a lot of gray area in there. Right now, if you say, hey, that looks an awful lot like a regulation, there's no way for somebody to challenge that. And so this simply provides a very easy mechanism to kind of throw up the, hey, let's slow down the train for just a couple seconds. Agency, please tell me why this is a guidance document as opposed to regulation. And then once the guidance document is published, so once it's already out there, there is actually a fail-safe mechanism that already exists for the APA, where this would go to the Attorney General's office if you wanted to take it that far. But it's really just meant to kind of level the playing field to ensure that if you have a guidance document, that it is indeed a guidance document, doesn't need to go through the APA. Just to kind of illustrate why this was an issue, why it was brought to my attention, I have a colleague who actually works in the dam safety field. And so he was dealing with a regulation dealing with dam safety. It got published. It didn't have an opportunity for public comment. What he realized was it was pretty significant with respect to the financial impact, but actually in the guidance document, it actually was counter to what the state enabling legislation authorized. So you had a conflict between the guidance document and the state law. And what he said is if it had simply come out and been provided for public comment, I could have easily gone ahead and called that out. But instead, you have a guidance document that's out there, and now it's wreaking havoc among the regulated community. I'll give you kind of another example, and this is a case where DEQ, you have a regulation that was relatively simple. The guidance document is 88 pages with lots of wonderful charts, and this is really the meat of what your localities have to do. Now, in this case, DEQ did it right. They actually had a pretty rigorous stakeholder input process, and as a result, I think you wound up with a pretty good piece of paper, but that's not required in the law for any of this. And so this doesn't apply just to any of the environmental stuff. It's simply a way to make sure that as we put together guidance documents, that you do have an input process in there. Based on discussions with the AG's office, we did limit this so that it doesn't include some of the more ministerial things. And so if you've got just technical bulletins, things like that, legislative summaries, those aren't things that we're really very interested in. We wanted to make sure that we're targeting the more substantive guidance documents that are out there. I'll tell you, I got a lot of great feedback as why you have a streamlined version. So I did hear some good input from the AG's office. from other regulatory offices, from the regulatory town hall, and I know they can't take an official position, but I really appreciate them helping me to go ahead and focus this in, just so that we provide some transparency to the guidance document process. And Mr. Chairman, that's what it does, right there before you.
All right. Any questions from the committee? This is a novel concept. Any questions from the committee? Discussion? Delegate, please.
It looked like there may be some people, Mr. Chairman,
I
that
think
want
we're
to speak
speaking
in
here
favor.
to space, but have some folks to speak in favor of the bill.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, Katie Payne of Williamsville on behalf of the Associated General Contractors. Very supportive of this bill. My understanding is DPOR currently does this, but we think it is a best practice that could be spread across the Commonwealth and be very beneficial.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, Keith Martin with Virginia Chamber of Commerce. We are also supportive of the bill.
All right. Thanks, sir. Anyone else to speak in favor of the bill? In opposition to the bill? Move to report.
Second.
I have a motion, properly seconded, to report. All in favor? Everyone voted that cares to vote? All right, clerk, close the roll. Ayes have it, 6-0. Now, I do have a question. If I have somewhere to be at 4 o'clock, will we have a forum? But we need one. We'll folks will say about that 5
Anybody else can leave.
I should be back very, very quickly, hopefully. But I understand the chairman wants to take me first. If that's okay, I can present my bill.
Thank you very much,
All right.
Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Delegate Bolton, thank you. All right, it's okay. Well, do we have any legislators here that need to present? I need to present one to get somewhere. Do you have anywhere to be, Delegate Robinson?
Just a second. I have a subcommittee at 4.
Okay, I shouldn't take but 2 seconds if that's okay. House Bill 574. And your attention. This is a very narrowly focused piece of legislation dealing with stream restoration that allows our counties and municipalities to seek stormwater and stream restorations. Basically permits local governments to maximize public environmental benefits by providing the highest quality stormwater restoration projects. It allows delivery for stream restoration projects. It allows to utilize staff resources. And basically what we're trying to do is a very narrowly focused amendment to the procurement statute. And I'd actually like to get these folks that have been working on this to help us meet our TMD quality standards. And our localities are struggling with trying to meet those standards. This is very narrowly focused amendment to the statute. I'd like to get Mr. Warner to speak to that if that's okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Shannon Farmer.
There's a substitute. There's a substitute. And we've had a number of folks work on this.
Move the substitute, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Without objection, substitute for us.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Shannon Varner here on behalf of Resource Environmental Solutions. Resource Environmental Solutions, or RES, is a private company that's involved in stream restoration and implementation of stormwater management practices. Does a lot of this work for localities to help reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment in our waterways, to help meet the Bay TMDLs and other local water quality issues as well. One of the, I think everyone is familiar with the expense that local governments are facing in trying to meet stormwater requirements. One of the common themes that we have heard from localities is that the procurement process for really acquiring these services to implement these things have been caught up in the prohibition on utilizing cooperative procurement and boosting their costs. And so this would provide the very narrow exception that Delegate Hodges mentioned for stream restoration and stormwater management practices, so those funds could better be used towards implementing these practices and support it.
If I may add, especially in our small rural localities, it will give tremendous benefit to them to utilize the resources more effectively.
Exactly.
Anyone else to speak in favor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Phyllis Rico from the Virginia Association of Counties, also speaking from the Virginia Municipal League. This is a very helpful bill for localities, and we support this bill wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman, member of the subcommittee, Bill Hefty from the Virginia Association of Governmental Purchasing. We also support this bill. Thinks it gives purchasing people another tool in our toolbox to purchase these sorts of stream credits.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Katie Bain with the Associated General Contractors again. We also support the bill as it's currently drafted. I typically stand before you and say that we don't like any exception made to the rule prohibiting construction used in cooperative procurement, but because it's very narrowly tailored and because of the way you redrafted substitute, we're in a good place now.
And thank you very much for
Thank you.
working with us in this. All right. Anyone speaking in opposition? Have a motion to report? Properly seconded. Actually, I need to turn it over to Mr. Fowler. I can't do this.
So do we have a motion report?
Motion report.
Second.
Second. Any further discussion? Members shall cast their vote on the electronic machine. Close the rolls. Report for the substitute, 6-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congratulations, Mr. Huggins.
Appreciate it. Here's the rules again. Be someone else again.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, plural, chairman, chairpersons, no one else can leave, but we only have a couple more bills, so I think we'll get to things.
You okay?
And Delegate Fowler, I know Delegate Robinson's been very patient, and we appreciate that. I think Delegate Herring has a place to be for.
It's very brief.
Thank you.
Delegate Herrick, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. House Bill 15, sorry, my eyes, 21? 31? I'm getting old. This bill will require the Secretary of Homeland Security and Public Safety, as well as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to have a clearinghouse for presentations. And I bring this bill because I ran into a situation where I was just actually just trying to research presentations and studies that were done as part of Governor McCullough's task force on heroin and opioid abuse. I realized, though, that information is all over and not in one central place. And that I think is, in considering the opioid crisis that we're facing and the need for access to information, I think it's important that we have a central clearinghouse for not only we as legislators, but the public, the general public, healthcare professionals to go to see what is happening at the state level and studies that are being conducted. So basically, that's the bill.
Thank you, Delegate Herring. Members have any questions for the patron?
Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, just two questions. One, am I safe to assume that the Secretary supports the bill, they want the bill? Maybe I shouldn't ask questions, I know
No,
that.
that's what I'm, no, they were advised, and I have not heard.
Okay, and
Right.
Mr. Chairman, my second question is, and it's really maybe rhetorical, but just was looking at the fiscal impact.
Yes.
It says that there's additional funding of up to maybe $109,000 that would be required to implement the bill. Is that accurate?
That is, yes, that's what I received, and
You may
unfortunately.
disagree with it, but that's what. it
Right,
is.
that's what they have advised, that it would.
Okay.
Delegate Hope?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to inform the patron that I'm carrying a similar bill from the Joint Commission on Healthcare that is doing this across all secretariats where they're collecting substance abuse data. There's also a bill coming over to the Senate. My bill has been passed HWI and it's gone to appropriations already. So it would be the proper motion if we were to put all that stuff in the same posture to report and refer to appropriations where they can all be sorted out there. So, I so move.
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Hope. That means we have a motion to report in front of duly sanctioned. Do members have any other questions? Members prepared to vote? Cast your vote on the electronic voting machine. Close the roll and
Bill 1101. And so through discussion with various groups, and I would like to see this bill be referred to the FOIA Council to be addressed. It has been before the FOIA Council before in Delegate Bell and Delegate Corey's bills in the past. Again, without resolution, but the difference will be that the FOIA Council is going to be made up of some new people. It has a new chairman, and hopefully we can get this resolved and come up with it. My heartburn with the bill personally is when I like the concept. I love the concept that we are going to, if you have a public meeting, you have to have, you have to have a public comment. But the problem with it is when we got to the discussion that, well, if you have more than 4 a year, you had to at least have public comment at 4 of those meetings. Well, Board of Supervisors might meet every week, so they could do their 4 public meetings in January and never have a public meeting, public comment time the rest of the year, even though there are some other places in the code that require it depending on what's going on. So that being the case, that would be what I would like to see this committee do.
The Uber chairman, would we want to carry this bill on?
We could certainly do that, or, we can lay on the table. We have a list of bills that we're gonna be sending a letter at the appropriate time to FOIA Council, for their consideration. Same with the Housing Commission and other, vehicles that we have to, work on measures in the all session, so. But we can lay on the table. It's really the pleasure of the subcommittee. And I appreciate the patron working with us on that.
Motion to gently lay on the table.
We have a motion to gently lay on the table. Is there a second?
Second.
One of the members, voice vote?
Is it
Recorded vote, prepared vote. Cast your vote on that machine. Close the rolls, and bill is laying on the table. 6-2, thank you.
So I do want to let the committee know that there is a Senate bill. Senator Peake has a bill that also is dealing in the same area. It passed out of the Senate today, so there is another vehicle that may show up in front of you yet to deal with this public comment period in a public meeting. So thank you.
Thank you. I believe that completes. Oh, I'm sorry, Delegate Lefowitz, I didn't forget.
Okay. All right, this is, let me find the House Bill number, House Bill 741. And this was brought to me by a constituent in an attorney who practices employment law. And what is attempted to correct or prevent is that when the Department of Human Rights conducts an investigation as to discrimination, they will conduct an investigation, but much of their findings or written documents are based upon hearsay, interviews that are not subject to cross-examination, and the belief is that those informal findings should not be admissible in a civil proceeding, because it's generally seen as as we know in the area of law, an official government document can generally be admitted without authentication, without the person who spoke the words being present and subject to cross-examination. So these findings and determinations by the board that have not been subjected to the same judicial scrutiny should not be automatically admissible into a civil proceeding. So this bill would prevent that, which would not prevent someone from subpoenaing the person who made the comment or remark and getting the information in through the normal evidentiary process. But in that situation, they would be subject to cross-examination and the other safeguards we have in place to make sure that we have authentic evidence before the court. And so it's probably more explanation than I will hear at this time of day, but that's what the bill does. And I ask for a favorable recommendation by the subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Lefowitz. Any members have a question for the patron?
Mr. Chairman, I think just maybe to council, we heard Delegate Lefowitz is good hearsay and what are exceptions to hearsay or exemptions to hearsay, et cetera. And I think what Delegate Left was just getting is that there's basically an out-of-court statement that's being offered in court to prove the truth of the matter, and they're able to get to that through this current, the way the law is currently written. He's trying to close that loophole. Am I correct, counsel, in
Yes.
saying that in
you
sort
are
of
correct.
layman's terms?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions for the patron? Is any member of the audience like to speak in for or against House Bill 741? Hearing none. Then I have, I guess, a question for the Uber chairman. Given your previous comments, I am wondering if this subcommittee is perhaps the correct place for 741. And
Mr. Chairman, we haven't received a directive by the Speaker's office to re-refer or to refer, and so if we act favorably with the recommendation, then the motion would be to recommend to report. I so move.
okay. And also we have a motion report, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, the motion to report has been seconded. Is there any other discussion about the motion?
Mr. Chairman, I would just simply say, if we were to get some directive or other guidance on this, for those purposes, we'll certainly work with the patron and inform the full committee.
I would say, the civil subcommittee is meeting tomorrow for the last time before crossover.
And so it'd be very difficult, if not impossible, Mr. Chairman, to respond to Delegate Hope, to procedurally get this bill to them in time.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. We have a motion. It's been seconded. Are the members prepared to vote? Cast your vote on the electronic voting machine. All right, we close the rolls. And the bill reports out 5-0. Thank you, Delegate Lethbridge. Mr. Chairman, that completes the docket.
and so and Mr. Chairman, just as a PSA public announcement, we will be meeting on Thursday. It's very likely we could have subcommittees number 1 and 2 meeting, because it's the last day to act before crossover in order to get the bills on the calendar for the pro forma Saturday on a third read by Tuesday of next week. We will have our full committee meeting set up after those subcommittees as opposed to our regular schedule.